Hello and welcome to another episode of Her Entrepreneurial Rise, the podcast where we amplify the stories of women and gender-expansive leaders using entrepreneurship as a force for social change, because their stories aren't just inspiring, they're blueprints for what's possible when equity leads the way. I'm your host, Kelen Tamurian, and I could not be more excited to introduce today's guest, Katrina Spade, founder and CEO of Recompose. Recompose is a public benefit corporation and licensed full-service green funeral home based in Seattle that is pioneering human composting as a climate-friendly alternative to the conventional carbon and resource-intensive death care practices of burial and cremation. Recompose's profoundly intentional process gently transforms a body into soil over the course of 8 to 12 weeks, producing a cubic yard of nutrient-rich soil that can be used to scatter or nourish the personal gardens of friends and family of the deceased, or to support conservation efforts, powering the restoration of the environment and new life after death. Offering personalized ceremonies, thoughtfully designed rituals, and spaces for communal gathering and reflection, Recompose is on a mission to grow a worldwide movement to reimagine the end-of-life experience as rooted in nature, and to ensure the passage from loved one to ancestor and from human to soil is reverent and careful. I am honored to be in conversation with Katrina today and spotlight how she is harnessing entrepreneurship through Recompose to imagine a new model of death care that both honors the lives of loved ones past and works to nurture the healing of planet Earth and ultimately cultivate climate justice. So let's welcome Katrina to the podcast. Hi, Katrina. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Well, just to kind of get right into it, I'm curious to know what inspired you to create Recompose.
Well, first of all, thank you for that lovely introduction. I actually started the concept of Recompose just over 10 years ago, and I was in grad school for architecture. So I hadn't experienced a death recently, and yet I was feeling my mortality somehow. And because design school was an opportunity for me to dive deeply into something, I chose the American funeral industry. And, how did I do that? Well, anyone who starts to look at the American funeral industry will be interested, I think, because it's a pretty fascinating topic. But in particular, because I was feeling mortal, started thinking about what I would want for my body when I died. It struck me that I wasn't interested in being cremated, and I didn't really want to be buried in the ground. And on top of that, I was surprised to realize there weren't other options on offer. And so because I was in grad school and because I had the time and the space to think about design, I said, well, what would I design if I wanted something for my body that was sustainable and felt meaningful?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think, there might have been a variety of reasons for why you were feeling particularly mortal in grad school. But I think as you're kind of coming to, depending on kind of where you were in your journey in grad school at the time, maybe coming towards the end or even starting the beginning of that new chapter of, okay, this is a new chapter that I'm stepping into at this time in my life. And that can bring all sorts of thoughts about what's next and all of the above. And I think because you were going to grad school for design, it makes a lot of sense that you were thinking about just thinking generally about the world around you. And then, with feeling mortal for a variety of different reasons, thinking about the funeral industry and then recognizing, as you mentioned, that if anybody were to look into it, that they would also be fascinated because there's a lot of room for improvement and there's a lot of room for exploration in designing it in a new way. And, in doing research for this interview, I know that you've talked a lot about how design is in everything, whether we notice it or not, and that intentional choices can completely change how people experience pivotal moments in their life, one being life after death. And so that makes a lot of sense in terms of, given that your perspective of, I believe that design is in everything, transferring it to, okay, I'm thinking about what comes next and I'm thinking about this budding interest that I have in the funeral industry. How can I merge my passion for design and my personal passion for climate justice and climate change, which I know we'll talk more about throughout the rest of this episode, but it makes a lot of sense that at that time you were kind of bridging a bunch of your different interests together, and Recompose was born out of that. Obviously, it's not that simple, but I always like to ask kind of the why and what inspired founders to start their venture, because it sometimes can be a, big revelation, but other times it can be a small stair step towards something big. And it feels like perhaps for you that was maybe the case, that you were just contemplating your mortality and contemplating the impact of design in the world around you. And then it came together with then your passion for taking care of the climate and being a good steward of the environment, that it all kind of melded together that way.
Yeah, I would say that the concept of human composting came to me in a little bit of a light bulb moment because I was thinking about the funeral industry, I was thinking about design, and then my friend told me about a practice that agricultural institutions and farmers use composting cows and horses. So that idea was a light bulb because I thought, oh, amazing, great. If you can biologically and safely and scientifically compost a cow, certainly you can compost a human being. And so I ran with that for my thesis project. But to your point, the idea of creating a business around it, that was definitely something that evolved over time. And I do think that I'm really grateful that the first thing that came to me was the idea and this exploration through design and for school, frankly, and then didn't have attached to it a budget, didn't have attached to it a what's the ROI, and didn't have attached to it, could this work? Like, is this too ridiculous? Because grad school architecture, you don't have to worry about that, right? Here's a wild idea that I put on paper the best I could. And only over time and especially through talking to others, and that's key, did I start to realize that there was potentially a business there. And to your point about a sort of stair step, that started with the very first moment I realized that there might be more to it than I thought was when I presented my thesis to a group of professors and students and their friends. And then we laughed a little bit, right? Because this idea of human composting was so out there at the time. But there was also a lot of nodding and this kind of like collective, like, oh yeah, this could work. Fast forward about a year or so, I applied for a fellowship through a foundation called Echoing Green. And the same thing happened where I was presenting the idea of composting human beings as a replacement for the polluting cremation, right? And I'm presenting them to a group of financial jurors for this foundation. They're like wearing suits and ties and work at Barclays and other financial institutions. And everyone in the room was nodding instead of going, what is this ridiculous idea? So I credit that to the fact that culturally, with the aging of the baby boomer generation and the onslaught of climate change, there's this kind of perfect moment where both we recognize the end of life is really important to look at and death occurs and we are mortal. And also we're looking at the climate in a different way, like, oh my goodness, we have a real emergency here. And so that 10 years ago was just beginning and was a perfect moment to offer up something like human composting. You kind of just to remember as an entrepreneur, all of those things come together in different ways. And frankly, my job has been to wake up in the morning and say, like, what is that next stair that I'm going to like, take one step? And it's a series of thousands of single steps.
Yeah, I really appreciate that perspective a lot. And I think it does speak to the entrepreneurial journey that it looks different for everybody. I think, going back to the beginning of yours and being in grad school and having the freedom to just explore this idea, not having the pressure of what's going to be the ROI on this, what's the budget, how is it going to work, and really just being able to dig into the fun of this idea and the excitement around could this potentially work. And then when you were able to really like build out your thoughts around it to be able to effectively articulate it to other people, then to your point of everybody over time started to nod instead of being like, what in the world is this person trying to do here? But recognizing that you were kind of coming up with this idea at this perfect moment of you're meeting the moment of the climate crisis, but also there is a cultural shift around we know what composting is. And if there's precedent here that you can compost livestock, and we are also organic matter that could potentially be composted. In my head at the time, I would have also been like, oh, yeah, that makes sense. And, she's clearly done her research and has made a case for this. This makes sense. So to your point of it's entrepreneurship for you is really, waking up every day and making the decision to take the next step, assessing what still needs to be done, assessing what is still exciting to learn about and to innovate around, taking that next step up the next stair. I think that's really, it's sound advice without it even necessarily maybe having been your intention to have been advice, but it's sound advice in terms of just acknowledging that it's always going to be little by little, one step at a time, but bringing in others to kind of validate your ideas and to provide feedback of, I don't necessarily know if you've thought about this, but getting, because to your point earlier of getting feedback from others is key and talking to other people about your ideas is key. I think that is really important to consider that, it's all about taking that next step of bringing people along with you to help really ensure that you're able to take the next step and not fall on the next one. And I think to your point as well about this solution coming up at the right time, you pointed to being able to explain that, human composting is an alternative to the polluting cremation and burial practices. And I think it's really important to acknowledge the impact of the conventional end-of-life practices such as cremation and burial, and recognizing that they're super carbon intensive and they account for a staggering amount of pollution and waste. So just to kind of set the stage for all the listeners here, regarding cremation processes emit around 233 kilograms of CO2 and also releases nitrogen oxides, carbon monoxide, particulate matter, and other toxic compounds into the atmosphere, engendering several environmental and public health concerns. And regarding burial practices, burial with a concrete vault and a monument or a tombstone emits more than 1,200 kilograms of CO2, and embalming fluids, mainly formaldehyde, leach into the soil and groundwater, posing carcinogenic risks for humans and animals as well as soil contamination. Additionally, the clearing of land to create space for conventional burial practice can disrupt local wildlife habitats, contributing to soil degradation and loss of native plant species. The environmental impact of the funeral industry is clearly very great, and the need for a greener solution to death care is also clear. So I'm curious, why did you see human composting as an essential piece of the broader climate solution puzzle? You kind of pointed to that earlier, but I want to kind of dig into it more here. How does Recompose's process for human composting contribute to our climate's resilience?
Well, composting is a pretty magical process. And I grew up with parents who composted pretty religiously. And of course, as a teenager, I was like, ugh, so boring. But also in grad school, I started to tinker a little bit with what is really cool about composting. Prior to the thesis work, or I guess it kind of adjacent to it, some friends and I built this project that was a compost heating system, because basically compost is, well, high level, it's very much similar to what's happening on the forest floor, as you have dead organic material that's decomposing and creating topsoil. The difference between that process and what composting is composting is natural decomposition, and it's managed by humans. So you never have composting out in the wild on its own, and it's natural decomposition. Composting is humans are making this process even just a little bit more efficient, more beautiful, whatever it is, but we're tinkering with it. So I built a compost heating system in grad school with a couple of friends and started to really fall in love with this process. So you mix together the right combination of nitrogen-rich and carbon-rich materials. Our bodies have lots of nitrogen and carbon in them. Straw has lots of carbon in it. Alfalfa is nitrogen rich. Wood chips are very carbon rich. So just to give you a sense, those are some of the materials we use. And when you mix together the right environment for microbial activity, you invite microbes to break down that organic material. And so that's what composting is. And lo and behold, if you add a human body to that beautiful environment, microbes will break down that human body too. The heat is created by the microbial activity. So I think it's kind of beautiful that, this process becomes quite warm. It becomes, again, quite warm, not from adding heat to the process, but because the microbes are doing their work and creating heat. That heat also, importantly, destroys harmful pathogens. So the reason that the compost we produce can be given back to family and friends to be used on their gardens is because it's safe through the microbial activity. So I guess that's just to say that I think composting is quite a beautiful and somewhat magical process. And it, aside that, there is energy that goes into the collection of plant materials because oxygen is critical for the process. Our system has a fan that runs to produce, make sure there's plenty of aeration. We have lights on in our building. Like, we use energy. But when you calculate the difference in the energy we're using to compost a body versus the energy you use to burn natural gas, or I should say fossil gas. My mom says, never say natural gas, always say fossil gas. So when you use fossil gas to burn a body, it is a tremendous amount of energy compared to composting. In addition, when you compost a body, you are sequestering all of the carbon in those materials into the compost. And then that compost is going onto and into the ground. And when you think about carbon, we don't want it in the atmosphere. We want it sequestered and then on the ground and in the ground. So the benefit is twofold. It's the avoidance of emissions and it's the sequestering of carbon. And then I would add another layer that I've realized over the years, which is that there is even more benefit than just the carbon footprint, is the fact that as humans, when we die, with this process, we can so directly return to the earth and so directly our molecules literally rejoin the ecosystem. And I believe that as more and more people choose human composting, that fact helps connect us to nature and makes us realize that humans are part of nature. It's a powerful time when someone dies to think about that and to consider our relationship to the natural world. So again, in addition to the carbon benefit, there's this bigger, broader kind of existential benefit.
Yeah, I love that perspective. And, for listeners, I should have kind of provided this context a little bit earlier to describe more about how Recompose's process works, because you provided so much insight there into how it actually contributes to our climate resilience. But I would love to provide a little bit more context to how the process works, just to then be able to respond more eloquently to all of the insights that you laid out there. So I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I understand that Recompose lays a carefully calibrated mixture of wood chips, alfalfa, and straw, like you mentioned, into a threshold vessel and lays a person's body on top of that mixture, then covering their body with more of that same mixture so that the body is cocooned inside of the vessel and inside of the plant material. Basic fan system pulls air through each vessel, as air is critical to the human composting process, because this human composting process is an aerobic process and oxygen is required to compost a body. And then once a week, the Recompose team rotates the vessel to ensure that everything inside is mixed well. The microbes, like you mentioned, in the plant material and air are reaching every part of the vessel and the body inside to ensure that it can be composted effectively. And then I understand that it takes between 30 and 40 days for a body to transform into soil and be effectively composted, and it takes another few weeks for that soil to cure. So through that process, like you mentioned, carbon is sequestered. We're not allowing it to go into the atmosphere, which ultimately contributes to bettering the reality that we're living in the climate crisis, that it's not further contributing to it. And then to your point about it being the impact of human composting is not only that it's bettering our climate resilience in terms of how we're able to progress through the climate crisis, that we're not further contributing to it, but it's creating an opportunity for humans to really return to nature and to recognize that we are all a part of a larger ecosystem in relationship to the earth. And I think that's really beautiful, that it's recognizing that this solution that you've developed is not only something that is ensuring that we don't contribute more harm to the crisis that we're unfortunately sitting in, but it's reminding us that there is more to life and death than what we have been kind of conditioned to understand or believe, that there is an opportunity for us to reconnect with where we have come from the earth. And I think that's really beautiful. So I wanted to provide a little bit more context there to ensure that listeners can better connect all of the amazing insights that you shared about how Recompose's process really furthers our climate's resilience. And feel free to kind of jump in there to provide some more insight. But I wanted to make sure that I could provide that context.
No, that's great. That's great. I think the last thing I would say is that for your listeners, the compost created by loved ones can go back to family and friends, to be used on gardens, to grow a memorial tree. It can also be donated to Recompose's land program. We work with nonprofit organizations that conserve and restore parcels of land around Washington state. So for folks who don't have a use for that compost, we have a very direct and beautiful use where that compost gets to go back to the broader ecosystem to do good work.
Yeah, that's wonderful that it's death is obviously a very sensitive and important time and an event for so many people and so many families, that the human composting process at Recompose, whether the family or person connected to their loved one that passed wants to then take that compost and use it to nourish their garden or to nourish the roots of a tree in their yard, or contribute directly to conservation efforts and have the legacy of their loved one live on in contributing to our climate's resilience and to making the world a better and healthier place for us to continue to live on, for the next generation to continue to live on. I think this really just segues into this next question about how, you've described how Recompose sees human composting as part of a broad movement to redesign the end-of-life experience. And you denote that at the heart of this movement is the belief that design matters deeply. Recompose's facility houses multiple spaces dedicated to honoring the passage of one's loved one through customizable ceremonies and rituals. Can you speak to those ceremony and ritual offerings and why intentional design is so important to ensuring the passing of one's loved one from live family member to ancestor and from human to soil is a reverent experience?
I think that part of it is just the person that I am is really interested and excited by design and changing perspectives. I mean, like, not to be really basic, but I love to rearrange my living room just to have a fresh perspective. And so it's not surprising that I came at it through a design lens, but I do think that it's been beneficial for the movement to have concepts like beauty and intentionality wrapped in with such a big change. Like, we're saying, let's not cremate your person. Let's actually transform them into soil. Let's compost your person. And, that can be a lot to hear and sort of take in. And so if it's wrapped in with some beauty, with some intentional design, we use, just for example, our website. For your listeners, it's www.recompose.life. But we try really hard to just have it be not only very functional and informational, but really thoughtfully designed and beautiful. And I think, again, it's like we're offering this idea and it should come with good design. And then on top of that, what's one aspect is just how early days when we were looking at legislation, because it wasn't legal to compost a body in the early days, and we had to bring legislation to Washington State and then other states. Since then, I recognized that legislators were people. They'd be hearing this idea. And so how we couched it and what words we used around it and the importance of being direct and clear but palatable, all of that mattered a lot. And so again, it's it just matters how you present something. And the more practice you have ever, for those of you looking for, entrepreneurial advice, the better. So more applications, more talking to friends and family about things, all of that's going to help. The second part is that with the rise in cremation over the past few decades, and cremation rates, by the way, nationally are at about 60%. So 60% folks choose cremation, and that's growing. In the Washington State region, it's somewhere around 90%. So just to give you a sense, lots of folks choose cremation, and especially in urban centers, and that is growing every day. But with the rise in cremation, I believe we've said to ourselves more and more, just cremate me, don't make a fuss. When I die, just cremate me. Don't make a fuss. I don't want a funeral. Okay. Now, it's very possible that people don't want a funeral because the funerals on offer don't feel meaningful anymore. They maybe aren't. They're the old way, and maybe nobody wants that anymore. So I understand that inclination, and I believe that it's really important when someone dies to mark that moment. So I, in a way, used Recompose and the rise of human composting to say, hey, we're offering you something new. This is brand new. We're going to tell you all about it. We're going to tell you why we think it's worth looking at. And by the way, if you choose to be composted, you may also want to choose to have a ritual that befits your person, that honors them, and that sort of marks the moment as they're starting their journey from live human being and this transformation into soil. And it's really been an opportunity. This new form of death care has been an opportunity to bring ritual back. And so at Recompose, the way we do that is we create spaces and sort of framework for ritual that encourage that marking of the moment.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes so much sense. To kind of go back to the beginning of what you said, of it matters how you speak about something, whether, you're trying to explain something to somebody, or with your example with the legislators, that human composting wasn't legal. And so we had to speak about this very intentionally to denote that this is a new way of approaching death and a new way to administer death care, because we're also recognizing that, and to your point about cremation, that so many people are saying, just cremate me, don't make a fuss. I don't want the traditional funeral, because maybe what they've seen about the funeral industry, or if they've attended funerals of loved ones in the past, it didn't resonate with them personally. So there was such an opportunity for design here, to design it differently, to design how we speak about death differently, to design rituals around death differently, to really ensure that people feel that they or their loved ones are going to be honored in moving into this next phase of life and what comes after it. And so I think it's really important and beautiful that you recognize that there is opportunity here for innovation around this, and there's an opportunity to design a new solution that really meets the moment of the climate crisis, but meets people where they are and provides them with something new to bring that care back into the moment of death. Like you're saying, it's important to mark that moment because it is really important and it's sensitive, and it's something that we all contemplate at some point in our life. Maybe we choose to, build something around it like you did, but we've all thought about what comes next, and it can be really scary for many of us and really sad and sensitive. And so ensuring that ritual is a part of and creating frameworks around ritual at Recompose is so important. And it goes back to that idea that death care can be a deeply nourishing experience for both the earth and the families of the deceased. So from what I've gathered in learning more about Recompose and from what you've shared today, I really see it as a vital reimagining of death care and an innovative means of contributing to climate justice. So I'm curious to dive into the how behind how you built Recompose and how those who are inspired by your story and passionate about caring for people and the planet can take from your experience and begin their own entrepreneurial journey to engender positive change. So to start off, how did you secure early funding or resources to start your venture?
Well, I began by actually applying to the fellowship I mentioned, Echoing Green Fellowship. Before that happened, I was working a day job in an architecture firm, and I had made a website and started again to get this indication by talking to people that there was interest in this idea beyond my parents and me and my closest friends. And so I applied for the funding through this fellowship and was surprised to get that funding. And it actually allowed me to quit my day job and work full time on the project. I started a 501c3, a nonprofit organization at that point. It was called the Urban Death Project. And the goal was to continue to build community and do early proof of concept, like research and understand what barriers were in the way of actually bringing this to the world. And I ran that organization for 3 years. I got individual donations through that 501c3 and not really much foundation funding after the first one to the fellowship. Foundations weren't quite like funding death stuff yet. Maybe they do now. But I did a Kickstarter campaign, raised about $90,000 through people all over the world who were just interested in the concept. A lot of changes happened since then in terms of the kind of engineering and design of the process, but the concept, high-level concept, is still there. And then in 2017, I decided I needed more funding, like in the millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars range. And so I closed the nonprofit and started a public benefit corporation. It's a type of C Corp. It's a for-profit company, but it has environmental and social benefit as part of its bylaws. So we were able to then I started raising money from individuals. So technically all angels. I've had no institutional funding to date, no venture capital, all from individuals who are deeply moved by the idea of this existing. And since 2017, I've raised about $20 million that way. And again, all through individuals with wealth. And boy, that's about talking to people and networking and getting connected and telling your story over and over again.
Yeah. And I think that'll kind of foray really nicely into the next question, but I want to touch on, I feel like your experience in sourcing funding for this venture really kind of goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning of this conversation about the stair steps, that it didn't necessarily look like, okay, I'm going to, pursue angel investment from the beginning, but recognizing that, okay, I can apply to this fellowship and I was surprised to get funding there. How can I use that? And then opening and starting the 501c3 and leveraging funding and resources that you were able to glean there, and then closing that and recognizing, okay, actually we're scaling and we need more support and resources here. So how can I create a environment to obtain funding that actually resonates with me and that supports the venture that I'm trying to build? I think the fact that you created a public benefit corporation as opposed to just a normal, C Corp and going the traditional VC route is really important to acknowledge that you can develop a funding route that feels aligned for what you're trying to create. And then to your point about garnering support from angel investors, this kind of next question is about how you went about building a team or support network to bring your mission to life, and how did you kind of intentionally speak about the problem and your vision to get others to believe in it and want to be a part of the solution that you're creating? Typically, I ask this question about really like, how did you build your team? But I think, and you can answer to that end as well. But I think it is important to think about when you are asking for funding from others, it is really important to be intentional about how you speak about what you're building, because you want to get others to believe in it because you're asking them to invest in you. So I'm curious kind of to hear your perspective on that.
I think it's two-part in that when you're talking to potential investors, you have to tell this big, beautiful story. And that's one piece of it for sure. And at the same time, during the same conversation, you have to show what you've done that's tangible. Because especially as early founders, especially when you're a single founder for several years, investors are investing in the person. And it's not that they're saying, I like you necessarily, but they're investing in your ability to get a thing done, take that next step. And so to be able to show, okay, here's what we did, here are the last milestones, and here's what we're doing next. And over, and the milestones grow, and you still have somehow just as many things to get done. That never shrinks. But I think just to recognize that it's two parts. It's showing the big story, the why, and then showing not just the how you're going to do it, but what you have done. And I think that's why I've been able to raise over the years because we've shown great traction. And then you have to continue to show that traction if you're going to continue to raise. So, yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It sounds like, much like the rest of entrepreneurship, that it's an amalgamation of so many things and so many ways that you need to kind of be able to iterate, like, this is my why, this is what I've done, this is what I want to continue to do, this is the support that I need. It's about really building this larger story about why does this really matter to me and why does it matter to exist in the world? What is it doing for others? I think for everybody that has come on this podcast, everybody has created a venture or is working within a venture that's working to further positive social change or social justice. And so that question is really key of what does this do for the world around me? And I think painting that picture for investors makes a lot of sense as well of this is not just, something that I'm passionate about doing, but it's something that's actively making an impact on the world. And this is our proof of how we've done that. And I think, the next question that I had for you is, what advice would you offer to someone with an entrepreneurial mindset and desire to do impactful work and make a change in their community or field? And I think you've sprinkled in pieces of advice throughout all of these questions. And, I think to what you just said about it's about really crafting that larger story and iterating why and what you've done and how it matters and how, you want to continue to go on and do that work forward. Whatever else that you would like to offer about advice, I know that I and all of our listeners would love to hear because you've provided so many great little golden nuggets throughout this conversation.
Let's see. Well, I guess, yeah, I've sprinkled in some advice. So the last piece would just be curious. Pick something that you're curious about because at the same time, it's going to be a long journey no matter what, pretty much. So the best case is that you wake up every day and you're like, I really am curious about how to make this next piece happen or why this is this way and not this other way. And so if you're not curious about your topic, if your gut says, I don't really care, walk away, take some time, something else will come to you and make sure it's something that you truly are curious about.
Yeah, I love that advice. My parents raised both me and my younger brother to really just be endlessly curious about the world around us and to continue asking questions about things that we feel we already do understand and to ask questions about things we don't yet understand because there's always more to learn and there's more to learn from other people that have different perspectives on a topic or an issue. And so I think as it pertains to entrepreneurship and just life in general, being ever curious about what is going on around you and not getting discouraged if you felt initially that you were curious about something and then to your point, you're like, I don't really care anymore. It's okay to kind of pivot and to trust that something else will come your way that you will be instantaneously and forever curious about. I think that's really wonderful advice just for, entrepreneurship, but also just for life, that it's important to be curious about the things that we experience, the things that we feel that we already understand and the things that we don't yet understand because there's so much to learn and there's so much room for opportunity for innovation around the things that we are curious about. So I think that's really wonderful advice. Thank you so much for coming on today. This was such a pleasure to talk to you and to learn more about Recompose and to learn more about your story. Everything about Recompose in terms of where to find them, what they're doing, how to, if you might be experiencing a death in your family and are interested in learning more about human composting, all of that information will be in the show notes below. And I just want to thank you again for coming on. It was such a pleasure to talk to you today.
Thank you. It was great to talk to you too.
Thank you for joining me for this episode of the Her Entrepreneurial Rise podcast. The Her Entrepreneurial Rise podcast was founded, hosted, and produced by me, Kelen Tamurian, president of the We Lead Student Board, with support from the Burke Center for Entrepreneurship in the Foster School of Business at the University of Washington. I'm so grateful to have you along for these conversations, amplifying the stories of impact-minded women and gender-expansive innovators whose ventures and life's work shine a bright light on the radical possibility of entrepreneurship as an engine for positive social impact. If you'd like to learn more about the entrepreneur or leader featured in this episode, their journey, business, and mission, be sure to check out their website and social media platforms, all linked in the show notes. There you'll also find a list of the statistics, articles, and resources mentioned in this conversation for your further research and exploration. To stay connected with the Her Entrepreneurial Rise podcast and the Women's Entrepreneurial Leadership Program at the Burke Center for Entrepreneurship at the University of Washington, follow us on social media and visit our website, both linked below. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please rate, review, and share the podcast with a friend, classmate, or fellow believer in the power of entrepreneurship to spark positive change. Your support truly means the world and is the best way to help grow the show. I'm so happy you're here and part of the Her Entrepreneurial Rise community. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next time.